The topic for this lecture is anthropological linguistics. Linguistics is traditionally one of the four subdisciplines of anthropology, important enough to be ranked up there with physical anthropology and archaeology. But since USI doesn't offer a course specifically in anthropological linguistics, we'll look at it briefly today in this cultural anthropology course. That makes sense because the topics and methods used in the two subdisciplines are closely related. Be aware, of course, that devoting a single textbook chapter and one lecture to linguistics isn't enough to do justice to the whole field. I can't cover the whole subdiscipline here, but what I can do is give you a sense of the kinds of questions about culture that the study of language can help us to answer, and the techniques that we can use to find those answers. We should start with communication. Communication is actually a fairly difficult idea to define because most simple definitions rely on equally nebulous concepts. Generally, you can say that communication is the transfer of an idea or information from one person's mind to another's. It's a three-stage process. In stage one, in the first person's mind, an idea exists, here represented by the image of a tree. That idea is codified into a sign, the word tree. In stage two, the transmission of that sign occurs. In linguistic communication, this is the act of speaking, but communication can also involve writing, gestures, or any number of ways to convey the sign. Finally, in stage three, the recipient of the message perceives the sign and decodifies it back into the concept it represents. Thus, the same idea, the image of a tree, now exists in both persons' minds. That's communication. Language is the most significant communication system used by humans, but it's not the only one. Much information can be conveyed through nonverbal means like body language, expressions, or even spatial arrangement. The term for the study of this kind of communication is kinesics, and it's very closely tied to linguistics in anthropology. Some researchers believe that much nonverbal human communication is universal. Emotional states, for example, seem to be expressed in facial expressions pretty much the same throughout the world. An angry expression is understood as angry regardless of one's cultural background, for example. But culture can significantly alter how someone uses nonverbal communication. Emotional expression varies greatly from Arabic cultures where everyone is encouraged to freely express intense emotions through wailing and hitting themselves, to the sober Japanese, who tend to try not to show negative emotions at all. So while the communication system may be shared, the messages sent with that system might be quite culturally determined. Communication, especially communication through body language, is not unique to humans, of course. All animals communicate with one another in some way, usually through body language, scent, and occasionally sound. Sound communication among animals is known as a call system. Calls are sounds with specific meanings, but they're always used in the immediate presence of the thing they mean. For example, vervet monkeys in Africa have separate calls for different predators. When a monkey sees a predator, he makes that predator's call, and the other monkeys respond in ways that show they understand which predator is indicated. For example, they run and hide under things when an eagle is spotted, or they climb trees to escape leopards. But each call is only made when the actual predator is seen. Vervet monkeys never chat about past encounters with predators. And new predators that have never been encountered before can't be warned against. Those natural call systems, therefore, do not constitute true language. Language is a communication system using arbitrary symbols and capable of transferring abstract or possible ideas. Language demonstrates both productivity and displacement. Productivity is the idea that new words can be generated to mean new ideas. Displacement is the principle that language can refer to circumstances that are not immediately present. Neither quality is present in natural call systems among wild animals. Animals in the wild do not communicate about the future or the past, or about animals that aren't immediately present. Their communication is always about the immediate present, the way things are, not the way they were or the way they may be. Thus, they aren't language. Some animals may be taught to use language, however. Linguistic researchers in real life have had remarkable success teaching apes to use human sign language, and those apes have often shown at least some capacity for productivity and displacement. Your textbook describes several examples that prove apes have some limited capability for language, provided humans are there to teach them how to use it. Language is a very broad topic, and anthropological linguistics has been traditionally split into several smaller fields. We'll look at just 4 of them: descriptive, or structural linguistics, historical linguistics, cognitive linguistics, and sociolinguistics. Each of these fields asks different questions about language and finds answers to them using different techniques. Structural linguistics is the heart of linguistics. It's the study of how languages construct and transfer information. It asks, how is it that this information is encoded into that sequence of sound waves? Central to structural linguistics is the idea that the sign is arbitrary. That is, there's no necessary or natural link between the sound of a word, the signifier, and the idea it communicates, the signified. Languages work by everyone agreeing consciously or subconsciously on the meanings of words. Other cultures agree to represent the same ideas by different sounds, and no one culture is right. For example, in American culture, the sound dog represents that 4-legged barking animal over there. But in German, that thing isn't dog, it's der Hund. And in Japan, it's inu. No one is right or wrong, they're just different. This means that ultimately, language is just one form of culture with a capital C. Ideas that we share with one another about how to communicate effectively. And everything we discuss that applies to culture, that is learned, adaptive, integrated, and so on, also applies to language. Once we accept this idea, then we can start studying language in a culturally relative fashion. Why do those speakers make those choices, given their cultural context? Without appreciating that the sign is arbitrary, we might get sidetracked trying to understand why Germans don't understand that it's really dog rather than der Hund, and we never really understand the German language. Structural linguistics describes language according to several dimensions of variation, called phonology, morphology, and syntax. Phonology is the study of how languages make use of sounds. Since all humans have the same vocal organs, all humans are capable of making the full range of sounds, though sometimes it takes some practice to get the right sounds to come out. However, no language makes use of all possible sounds. In all languages, similar sounds are combined and lumped together into units called phonemes. A phoneme is a set of sounds that a language groups together as interchangeable. Changing sounds within the same phoneme does not change meaning. For example, in Japanese, the sounds l and belong to the same phoneme. A Japanese speaker can say arigato or arigato, and most other Japanese speakers will understand the same meaning. Thank you. On the other hand, English separates l and into separate phonemes. Liver and river have very different, entirely unrelated meanings. Because the different sounds of a phoneme make no difference to meaning, speakers often are not able to easily hear the differences between them. They also often have difficulty pronouncing the different sounds when learning a new language with a different set of phonemes. This is one reason that it's often possible to guess a person's native language based on his or her accent, because they speak a new language using a slightly different phonology, one more closely related to their native tongue. Morphology is the study of how meaningful sets of sounds are combined with one another to form words. A phoneme has no particular meaning in and of itself. Doesn't mean anything in particular, and neither does Switching from one to the other does change meaning, but the phonemes themselves don't have meaning. On the other hand, when one or more phonemes are combined in a particular order, they can carry meaning. Combining with n creates un and carries the meaning of not. D, a, g in that order makes dog and also carries meaning. Both combine multiple sounds together to convey a meaning. The term for a set of sounds that carries a single, indivisible meaning is morpheme. A word is a combination of one or more morphemes. For example, dog consists of one morpheme, but dogs has two, the dog morpheme and the z morpheme that indicates a plural. Some morphemes are bound, meaning that they only carry their meaning when combined with other morphemes, like the plural s at the end of an English word. Others are unbound and carry their meaning independent of other words, like dog. The catalog of the bound and unbound morphemes of a language and their meanings is called a lexicon. Languages differ in their ratio of bound and unbound morphemes. English has mostly unbound morphemes. Aside from a few prefixes and suffixes, most of our words can stand alone and still carry some meaning. This is called an atomic language because most words carry a single indivisible meaning. Many Native American languages are synthetic languages, where words synthesize and combine many bound morphemes to merge many different meanings. In some cases, a single word in a Native American language will translate to English as almost a complete sentence. A very influential linguist named Edward Sapir gave the example of the Paiute word "we tokuchumpunkuru ganwi yugwivantum," meaning they who are going to sit and cut up with a knife a black cow. The last branch of structural linguistics is syntax, how words are combined into phrases and sentences. In many cases, when you studied grammar in grade school, you were actually studying syntax. Syntax in English is heavily dependent on word order. The man bites the dog means something very different from the dog bites the man. The difference lies in which noun, man or dog, is doing the biting and which is being bitten. That is, which is the subject and which is the object. In English, the subject precedes the verb and the object follows it. So by reversing the order of the nouns, we change the meaning of the sentence. Other languages that are more oriented toward bound morphemes, like German, may convey who's doing the biting by other words. Der Mann beißt den Hund and den Hund beißt der Mann mean the same thing. In this case, the bound morphemes at the ends of der and den, the r and the n, indicate which noun is subject and which is object, and their order before or after the verb is largely irrelevant. So, structural linguistics describes how meaning is encoded into the speech. Once we know that, we can start asking broader questions about language and using it to help us understand culture. Historical linguistics is the study of how languages change over time and the historical relationships among them. No language is static, but rather they change over time as people's patterns of speech change. Remember, language is culture, and culture is always dynamic. New words are invented, old words drop out of usage, pronunciations change. A single language may even diverge into two or more mutually unintelligible languages if different speakers change their language in different ways. Traditionally, historical linguistics has been concerned with determining language families, the relationships of which languages have developed out of which others. For example, Most languages spoken in modern Europe belong to the Indo-European language family. They all developed out of a single ancestral language, and so they all share similarities in vocabulary, phonology, morphology, and syntax. By looking at the structural linguistics of each language, we can identify the family resemblance. Based on the similarities and differences among closely related languages, historical linguists can sometimes reconstruct some features of the ancestral language from which they all descended. Such reconstructed ancestral languages are known as proto-languages. Proto-Indo-European, for example, is thought to have been spoken several thousand years ago in what is now either Ukraine or Turkey. Speakers of Proto-Indo-European then spread outward from there, bringing their language with them. Over the next millennia, the single language has evolved into almost every other language in Europe and several elsewhere in the world. So how did those changes occur? First, of course, all languages are always evolving. Even if Proto-Indo-European hadn't split, today's Proto-Indo-European would be a very different language from the one spoken 6,000 years ago. But language is also something spoken by many individual people, each of whom has their own speaking patterns and topics of speech. Language is culture, but culture encompasses individual variation as well as shared ideas. So, for example, geographical separation by distance, mountains, or seas can lead to different changes taking place in the speech of different groups of people. The different groups may be concerned with different issues, adopting different focal vocabularies. Focal vocabularies are topical vocabularies, words and ideas that are only useful in certain activities. The more a cultural group engages in an activity, the more developed its focal vocabulary will become. So, for example, fishermen have many more words for fishing tackle and boats than farmers who live hundreds of miles inland. So as people move from one environment or way of life to another, their activities change and so do their focal vocabularies. Words change until they can no longer converse with related groups who live differently. Similar divergence may take place when the distance involved is social rather than topical or geographical. Upper-class people may choose to speak in certain ways to set themselves off from the commoners, for example. By making many small changes of these sorts over time, a single language can eventually become split into several mutually unintelligible languages. Small changes can add up until people can no longer communicate with one another. If languages can become more different, they can also become more similar. Close social relationships with speakers of another language will often lead to borrowing of words. When items or practices diffuse from one culture to another, they often bring their own names with them, so that Americans now eat sushi and Japanese listen to iduru, or pop idols, on the radio. So, historical linguistics, by looking at how languages change over time, can help us to understand how cultures change over time, because, again, language is culture. Cognitive linguistics is the branch of language study that uses language as a window into more fundamental ways of thought. Thought and cognition, and the role that culture plays in each, is examined by how it is expressed in language. We're so dependent on language for communicating with one another that from an early age we even use language to communicate with ourselves in our thoughts. And because of that, it's extremely difficult to think without thinking words. For that reason, the words we use can reveal the thoughts we think. Thus, cognitive linguists will study how languages categorize and classify plants and animals, how the parts of the body are divided and named, which colors are assigned particular words and which are only named metaphorically, and how abstract concepts are communicated. On page 89, your textbook describes one classic study of color terminology, showing that there's a standard, if not quite universal, way that color terminology enters languages. This suggests that something innate in our cognition is involved in recognizing colors. One of the central ideas in cognitive linguistics is the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, named after two famous linguists who first formulated the idea. The hypothesis basically suggests that different language structures, as described by structural linguistics, affect the underlying thought patterns of the speaker. So, a speaker of a language that uses many finely graded honorifics, like Japanese for example, will more easily think about fine gradations of rank. An English speaker, whose language has relatively few honorifics, will find it harder to grasp fine differences. Language doesn't determine thought, or there would never be any new ideas or words introduced to a language, but language can guide thought and emphasize some ideas over others. So, cognitive linguistics uses language as a way of getting at something more fundamental, how our minds create thoughts and generate ideas. But even here, we see that there's a very complex relationship between thought, language, and culture. Sociolinguistics is the study of how language is actually used in society. Social information about statuses, obligations, and expected behaviors is some of the most important information humans have to communicate. So it would be no surprise that language is often finely tuned toward that sort of information. Sociolinguistics is the branch of anthropological linguistics that is most closely tied to sociocultural anthropology, and most of the examples given in your textbook address sociolinguistic studies. I'll just add a couple brief examples of my own. In many languages, different words are used to express the different social statuses of speaker and audience. German, for example, uses the pronoun du for people with whom the speaker is familiar and equal, and sie for those who are either unfamiliar or socially superior. Thus, when listening to a conversation among German speakers, it's possible for a third party to understand the kind of relationship that the others have. Is it close? Is it distant? Who holds a superior social position? It's even possible to see exactly when a distant relationship becomes close and friendly. One person will switch from sie to du, and the other then follows suit, effectively redefining the relationship on the fly. None of this is possible in English, which only has the single pronoun you. English speakers must use other, more roundabout ways of negotiating their relationships. Interestingly enough, this pattern of multiple pronouns is true for many European languages, and was even true for English until very recently. Before the 18th century, the English equivalent of du was thou, and you was the equivalent of the German sie. In the early 1700s, the religious group called the Quakers started calling everyone by the familiar thou. Because they were so strongly egalitarian, they rejected the hierarchy implied by using you and used the familiar equal term thou for everyone. So unpopular were the Quakers that other English speakers were anxious not to be mistaken as Quakers. So everyone else started using the formal you exclusively, so that after time thou fell out of usage altogether. So here we have an example of language conveying social information, Quaker or not Quaker, and that leading to a language change. Languages can also carry information about the gender of the speaker. This is different from the more familiar concept of gender from Indo-European languages, where every speaker uses the same vocabulary, but some words are considered masculine and others feminine. Traditionally, in Japanese, men and women often used entirely different words for the same concepts. A man would refer to himself as boku, while a woman would use the pronoun watashi. Both translate to English as I. When talking about water, men would say mizu, but women would say ohiya, and so on. Even though the speaker's gender was obvious to his or her audience, that information was also encoded into the speech. This allowed Japanese speakers to make assertions of gender identity as they spoke. A woman wishing to be assertive and outspoken, a traditionally masculine gender trait, might switch to the masculine vocabulary. while a man seeking to appear subservient and compliant, traditionally a feminine trait, would switch to the feminine vocabulary. Today, as the traditional gender inequality in Japanese culture is decreasing, so is the differentiation of gender vocabulary. Women today frequently use masculine vocabulary, but men still tend to refrain from using feminine words. So, by paying attention to sociolinguistics, we can see how people form and maintain the social relationships that are essential to human life, and we can gain insights into many other dimensions of culture that, perhaps, the speakers themselves aren't even aware of. In conclusion, keep in mind that there's much more to anthropological linguistics than we've covered in the last few minutes. But hopefully, you've seen how useful the study of language can be in understanding culture and society, and why it's essential for anthropologists to pay attention to how we speak.